Thank you for joining us for this session. My name is Umbereen Mehta. I am a palliative care physician and chair of the INPCS Strategic Communications Committee. I am so pleased to introduce our next speakers, Marian Grant and Tony Back, who are experts in palliative care and messaging to the public. Marian Grant is the Senior Regulatory Advisor for the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care. She's a consultant for the Center to Advance Palliative Care and the University of Washington's Message Lab's Serious Illness Messaging Project. Dr. Grant is a nurse practitioner in the palliative care program at the University of Maryland Medical Center and an adjunct faculty at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins Schools of Nursing. In 2014, Dr. Grant was selected as a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellow working on Capitol Hill and at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. Before becoming a nurse, Dr. Grant had a career in marketing at the Procter & Gamble Company and worked on the Max Factor and CoverGirl cosmetics brands there. Dr. Anthony Back is a professor of medicine at the University of Washington Division of Oncology. He co-founded Vital Talk, which trains clinicians on how to talk about serious illness. He created the first online teaching videos of communication skills, authored the first smartphone teaching app for this purpose, and created the first video blog on this topic at vitaltalkconversations.com. For over a decade, he has been a senior teacher at the Upaya Institute's Being with Dying Contemplative Practice Program. Currently, he is the principal investigator for Message Lab, a national initiative funded by the John A. Hartford Foundation and the Cambia Health Foundation to create aligned public messaging for serious illness care. Before I hand it off to our speakers, I want to give a little background. Our committee's role is to share with the community and others why palliative care is necessary for neurologic conditions. Tony and Marian's work was instrumental in guiding our committee's progress to date, and I hope you'll find their talk today just as informative for your work as neuropalliative advocates.
Hi, I'm Anthony Bach, and I am here with Marian Grant. Hello, Marian.
Hello, Tony.
To talk about messaging principles for serious illness care. We are really grateful for this opportunity to speak to the neuropalliative care group. And so in preparation for this, what I did was a little Google image search that said, what do I get when I look at neurology and palliative care? And this is what I got. A person who needs a wheelchair, who we can't even see in the face, a bunch of hands. And if you look on Google Images, you will see zillions and zillions of hands. Then the other thing I found was a word cloud. You can put that up. And here's what it says: Parkinson's, cell, death, degenerative, rehab, age, shaking. Like, not that exciting. So like, this says in a nutshell about why we are here to talk about messaging. Neurology as a field has changed dramatically, and actually neuropalliative care has changed dramatically. So really the purpose of this presentation is to enable you to talk about the amazing work you are doing in ways that will make more patients and their families want to see you. So here's what we'll cover. The first thing we're going to cover is why this is needed. The second thing is what the empirical research shows about how lay people think about palliative care. 3 are tested principles that you can use for messaging. And 4, we're going to show a little bit of a new website toolkit that we have developed, and we'll get some comments and your thoughts. So the executive summary is really as follows. Basically, lay people don't understand the language that we use. Yet they do want what advanced care planning, palliative care, and hospice provide. It turns out that our existing messaging is really not reaching beyond our small audience. And then, of course, COVID has kind of thrown a wrench into all the messaging that all of us are doing. So the upshot is that when a serious illness happens, someone has an acute brain injury, a stroke, Parkinson's, patients end up declining services with proven benefits that could have helped them. That's the overall viewpoint here. And the bottom line is you can change this, right? So why is this needed? Like, we're doctors, you're experts, you're super good at what you do. Why don't people just listen to you and go, oh, I want what you've got? Well, it turns out most people don't know what our work is about. So if you're trying to update a brochure, you're trying to write text for a website, you're talking to a journalist, you're trying to pitch your leadership for more resources, what you have probably found is that you need acceptance from people who really don't know anything about what you're doing, right? And if we look at what that looks like in the literature, here's what we see, that in a big care redesign survey, the New England Journal surveyed a bunch of healthcare executives, and basically they said this: while the great majority of these healthcare organizations have a palliative or end-of-life care program, 60% of the patients who would benefit don't receive them. And the vast majority is about, the reason for the vast majority here is because the patients decline. Why did they decline? Next slide. Well, here's what they see on TV. This was a hit series a couple of years ago. New Amsterdam, a young, idealistic, handsome doctor starts a palliative care unit out of the goodness of his heart, and he calls it the graveyard. It's in a part of the hospital that is currently a storehouse. The other doctors ask him, what are we going to do? And he says, nothing. You're just going to talk to them. This is the public perception of palliative care in the United States. Next. Even when you look at, the intelligentsia, okay, here's the New York Times, our own commentaries continually reinforce our brand is we're about dying, right? So this was a little video documentary from this palliative care doctor who, honestly, she looks like a saint. I don't know her personally, but she clearly is, working from a higher calling. And yet it's really, to look at this is to have this message reinforced dramatically that her work is about dying. So when would you go see her? Only if you are dying. Next. So the idea of this project, which was funded by the John A. Hartford Foundation and the Cambia Health Foundation, was that we were going to look at what the future of palliative care looked like. Next. And what we came to was that patient engagement, public messaging was one of the two most important factors that would determine the future of the field. So here, when we get to the research, I'm going to turn it over to Marian, who's going to go through what that research showed. So,
thank you,
Marian.
Tony. So this has been an evidence-based project from the very beginning. Tony and I and some other people on the team took a look at what is in the research for the three types of serious illness care. So I know you guys are focused on palliative care, but we were focused a little bit more broadly on studies in the last decade or so about awareness and public attitudes towards advanced care planning, palliative care, and hospice. Those are the three components. And if you look at the people who are participating in the grant, they spanned those three areas. There's not a lot of research regarding the public awareness. Our field is small. We don't have a lot of resources. We don't do a lot of market research. But the studies that are out there and the ones that looked to have good validity confirmed that advanced care planning, the awareness is actually very high. But we know that consistently participation is low. And subsequent research shows us that the 2/3 of people who don't do it have good reasons that they don't do advanced care planning. So if you think your role in advanced care planning is to tell people about it, they already know. You've got to overcome their concerns. On the other hand, palliative care awareness is very low. Now, from a marketing standpoint, that's good, right? People don't know what it is. We can tell them what it is the way we want them to know. But among the few people who think they do know what it is, they had misconceptions. Most of them thought it was for the end of life, which again is a problem because although we know that these things can make the last part of life wonderful, most people are not wild about thinking about the end of life. And if they have competitive advertising from the pharmaceutical industry or cancer centers or hospitals that tell them that they could have these amazing lives, then they think our stuff is end of life. They're not going to be compelled by it. And finally, hospice's awareness is high and people think well of hospice, but there were some concerns about the quality and whether hospice hastens death. So this is the reality of the situation when we started in on this project. And we decided that we would focus on principles. And as we went through this, we really approached it as a marketing project. We worked with a marketing firm. I have a background before I became a nurse of being a marketing person. We have to realize we can't use ourselves as the target audience. We know what palliative care is, but the public doesn't. And our nuanced ways of thinking about these things is they're just not being heard. We also don't all have to use the exact same language. You need to talk about the work you're doing. CAPC needs to talk about the work they're doing. My hospital needs to talk about our work. So we decided that we would work on strategies and develop principles instead. And that the principal idea was that we could at least align on the focus and avoid consumer confusion with an aligned focus. So different organizations need different words, they might need different images, but we could all at least work with similar principles. And so we used a stakeholder process to create the messaging principles among the organizations, and they were some of the lead organizations in the field. And then we developed initial principles that were tested with older consumers and non-palliative care or non-hospice providers. And here were the principles we developed and tested. The first one is kind of marketing 101, talk up the benefits. So the idea that these services and care improve people's lives. And we have good evidence that when people hear about the benefits of palliative care, they are actually very interested in it. A second principle was presenting choices for every step, that people should know that at any stage of an illness, you have medical or treatment choices. The third principle is using stories, but these stories need to be positive and aspirational because that's what resonates with the public. Unfortunately, our field sometimes uses bad stories. We tell horror stories about horrible illness experiences or horrible deaths. And, therefore, the solution is palliative care. That's unfortunately not how it works in the public's mind. If you tell somebody a horrible story, they remember the horrible story and they associate you with the horrible story. They don't associate you with the solution. The fourth principle is inviting dialogue and not just once. The call to action in almost all of our public messaging, if you think about it, is we want people to reach out and get more information. We want them to talk to someone. So if you're going to talk about palliative care to the public, you're going to talk about it in such a way that the person should hopefully think, what is that? I'm going to ask my doctor about that. I'm going to be at the hospital tomorrow to see my mother. I'm going to ask the nurse about that. So, or I'm going to go online and I'm going to search for this thing called palliative care. And finally, the fifth and final principle was invoking a new team, that patients, families, clinicians, and community all have a role, and that's the team we should be highlighting. With that information, we then, with those message principles, we went out and we tested with them, and we did focus groups. Now it's back in 2019, so this is before the pandemic. We actually did them in person in Denver and Baltimore. We had 8 to 9 people per group. And the participants were, in some groups, they were 70 plus, because we wanted to talk to people who had experience with the healthcare world, but were not necessarily themselves patients. We talked to participants who were younger than that, because we wanted to talk to people who might be family caregivers. Again, don't necessarily have their own illness, but have a family member who might. And more than a third of the participants were ethnically diverse, although all of them had medical coverage of some kind. And here's what they told us about the principles. The first principle, talk up the benefit. They said, it gives you a handle on illness and it kind of broadens your perspective. It takes some of the pain away, some of the anxiety away. Well, now that's pretty good, right? If you talk about palliative care and that's the way people react. When we talk about choices at every step, what the public hears is it gives you a sense of control. It's what you want, not what they want. In regard to using stories, people said, oh, you can relate to something like this because the alternative is to explain how 72% of people do this and 32% of them do that. I'd rather have anecdotes about people. And we will show you later on how you could access the stories we tested. In terms of inviting dialogue, they said, oh, the important thing is to get the conversation going. And that is not threatening, it's reassuring. So it's not making a decision yet, it's talking about making decisions. And finally, they really liked the Invoking You team and the inclusivity of framing the conversation around we and naming all the players that were relevant, including patients, loved ones, and the care team. Tony, why don't you talk about additional learnings?
Yeah, there were some other really interesting things that we learned doing this consumer research. The first one was they really don't know what we're talking about. Like, I have heard the term advanced care planning so many times, right? It's totally background noise for me, but really in our focus groups, the moderator turned to us after like the third one and they said, have you noticed that nobody uses the term advanced care planning, right? I was like, they're right. Nobody uses that term. They don't know what we're, so when you use it, like, they probably don't know what you're talking about. Almost everybody thought palliative care was for end of life. Everyone, the people who said, I know what it is, they were all totally dealing with misconception. And they thought advanced care planning was the DNR order. They were confused by the idea that they should even set goals or express preferences. They have this story in their heads about a serious illness, which is about meeting a doctor they've never met before who comes in and tells them what they have to do, right? So, we have to step back in terms of talking to the public to realize that there is just a big gulf of non-awareness about where we start. So next, I think, Marian, we also talked to providers, and the providers who I think in your case are other neurologists, right? These are other neurologists who are like stroke experts and epilepsy experts and acute, brain injury experts. Here's what they said. And in our case, the people in our focus group were hepatologists, oncologists, cardiologists. They said they were hesitant to start these conversations. They said, we get a lot of backlash from patients. They said they wanted their expertise to be acknowledged. They said they don't understand the extremes we go to keep patients alive, right? They said they worry that patients will choose care they don't want to prescribe, right? And I think this has really been amplified in the COVID era. And I'll just mention also that we redid our focus groups post-COVID in the middle of the pandemic, and actually the findings were all supported. So many of these things really did not change with COVID. The fourth thing the providers said is that they all agreed about what hospice was, but they didn't agree about what advanced care planning or palliative care was. So actually what it means is that in your own place of practice, I bet your colleagues are dealing with several different ideas of what palliative care really is. And one of the things you can do is help them understand what you mean by this. Next. We also have been thinking about visuals. I started off with that montage of hands, and really, what do those hands mean? Actually, they don't mean anything now. They're just a meme for palliative care and a meme for dying. And so what we're saying now is visuals should be positive and aspirational, right? So click ahead a couple of times. So the hands, they should reinforce the benefits of serious illness care. So here's a real person, a real patient who had pancreatic cancer, like hanging out at his weekend cottage. These visuals should show patients and the public and your colleagues about what it means to live well, even in the face of a serious illness. That's what we have to get in people's mind, a picture of what it means to actually live with your illness, right? Next. The other thing we learned is that trust in the healthcare system is very low. When we asked them, do you trust the healthcare system to do right by you if you were diagnosed with COVID or another serious illness in the next few months or years? Basically, it was all no. No, I want to say yes. It's been good to me so far, knock on wood. I think a prime example of not trusting the healthcare system is back when we had the big shortage of ventilators, and then we had the death panels. The death panels, I just want to mention, are the horrible shadow of serious illness messaging, right? Because we didn't have a very clear message, a politician turned our message around into something purely for political gain, and it's still hanging around, right? Sarah Palin at the Republican nomination convention, it's still with you. Next. And consumers really perceive healthcare as pursuing its own interests, right? They think healthcare is a business. They think they have to fact check everything that you tell them. So that they said things like, I don't trust one person to give it to me. I would seek more than one opinion. I think I'd just be a Google doctor. The other one said, and we heard this countless times, you're just a number. Then another person told how they were actually in an ICU, got super sick. All these specialists appeared out of the blue, and the husband, and the person said, and this was, somebody who's viewed themselves as not having that much experience with serious illness. That's how they got into this focus group. She said, they had all these specialists on me, and my husband would say he felt like it was overboard. So he was like, oh no, my wife is not a cash cow. I tell that anecdote simply to sensitize you to where the general public is coming from. It's very different to talk to the public than to talk to a patient. So we have a way to help. Besides coming to this talk, which is fantastic, and we're glad you're here, we have something else for you, Marian.
Ta-da! So the last deliverable of our wonderful grant, after we came up with these principles and with this learning, was to develop a free interactive online toolkit. There is the address. You will have these slides. You will be able to go there. And what will you find in this toolkit? Well, you will find a whole bunch of information on how to message using these evidence-based principles. This is it's a website that has a page for each of the principles. There's a section for palliative care. There is a section on inclusivity. There are resources. You can download things. And what you can particularly download is we hired a copywriter. We bought the rights to beautiful photographs, stock online photographs, and you can steal those things. You can steal the words, you can steal the photographs. They will not cost you anything, and you can use them if you are in my hospital. We're updating the brochure for my palliative care program. We're going to be using the things off of the toolkit. So there's tips about talking to the media. There's all sorts of stuff on there. So it's going to be live in time for when this is going to run for your conference, which is wonderful. And there's also a place you can contact us if you have questions or comments about how it all worked.
Yeah. So check out seriousillnessmessaging.org. And then you can also email us directly. Next slide. I'm at the University of Washington, Tony back at uw.edu, and Marian is at comcast.net. So we hope this has given you some new ideas for how to think about how you talk to the public. So when you're talking to a journalist, when you're on a podcast, when you're talking to a community group, bring these principles front and center and make sure you start where the public actually is, because we need to capture their interest. And by doing that, you can grow your service and increase the demand for the work, the amazing work that you guys actually do. So
Tony,
thank you so much.
I think you've got a couple of more minutes. Do you want to say a little bit about clinical conversations versus messaging to the public?
Good point. So you know what? When we talk about messaging, we are talking about how we're introducing this topic to the public. And we think of clinical conversations where you are using your terrific communication skills as a different thing. So by talking of the benefits and starting out with all these positive things, we are not implying that you should not cover those things when you're actually talking to a patient and family who needs to hear about these things. We are saying, however, that is not public messaging. That is communication between a patient or family and a clinician, and that you should use all those skills and use all your judgments about when to do that. Marian, I don't know if you have another thing to add about that.
So I know I'm anticipating some of your concerns because we've done this talk a few times and people said, wait a minute, You're telling us we shouldn't talk about death and dying, and we're saying you can do that clinically. And in fact, I do that all the time. I help teams break bad news. That's what we do as palliative care people, right? But that's not what you do in the public messaging. In the public messaging, you try to focus on the positive aspects of this care, knowing that if people do sign up for it, a wonderful clinician will come and have the frank conversations, which at the appropriate point will talk about death and dying if that's what needs to be discussed. Okay.
Thank you for raising that. Okay. I think we're going to be around for your questions, and thank you so much for coming.
Fabulous. Tony and Marian, thank you so much for your presentation. It's really interesting to hear about that. We have some questions, and do remember please to post your questions in the question box, and I can put them to Tony and Marian. So first up, any opinions or data on whether to stick with the term palliative care or switch to supportive care? We started with an easy one. Yeah, Tony, you're on mute, I think, at the moment, so we'll go to Marian first, if that's okay.
So I can imagine what Tony is going to say. There is some data that in oncology that supportive care might be better, but I have to say, you know, palliative care is not a great name, but it is not otolaryngology, all right? So it could be worse. And I think that for better or worse, this is what the field is called. I think, you know, rather than trying to rename it, because I think even if we renamed it aardvark, if we keep talking about it the way we're talking about it, they're going to figure out that it's maybe about end of life. And so the big issue, I think, is for us to call it palliative care, but to talk about it as living well with a serious illness.
Right.
Tony.
I mean, Ed, I think this is about branding, right? It's not the name itself. So switching the name is not going to solve our problems. It has not solved the problems for oncology. Even the cancer centers that use supportive care now, they are still facing the same issues because they continue to promote it as dying. So basically, we have to change how we talk about the brand. So, you know what? I wish it were that easy, just changing our name. It's bigger.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess, you know, we have to be careful about if the waters are already muddied in terms of people understanding. If we keep changing terms, we're not going to help that situation, I guess. For the second question then, so for patients and family members who advocate for palliative care, what are the most important points for us to emphasize? And we do that a bit first, and then a second question about the toolkit. And whether it's available to us, but I think you covered that. I think you gave us a website for it.
Yes. You know, Ed, is your question about when we're talking to the public or when we are actually trying to recommend palliative care to patients and family members?
Yeah, so the question's in the chat here, so I'm not sure it's not specific. So I think, why don't we tackle both? So I think, first of all, yeah, let's talk about for patients and family members and their approach and their acceptance. That's the most important thing here, isn't it? Yeah. What's the most important thing for us to emphasize that makes this easier for people to integrate into their own care and accept it?
Yeah, so I'm going to say, when you're talking to a patient and family member that you are taking care of, right? That is clinical communication. That's not public messaging. So I want to distinguish that from what we just talked about, right? We were talking about when you're talking to journalists, when you're talking to a public group, right? When you're talking to a patient and a family, it's really all about what do they want and what do they think they need. And so if you are talking to a patient and family where someone's just had like a horrible acute brain injury, right? The issue that you should lead with is, what do they think they really need and want that you can provide? Instead of going into a big thing about how palliative care is this and that, when we have this interdisciplinary team and we take care of people until the end of life, you can actually save yourself some time and say, oh, I hear you're concerned about anxiety. I hear you're worrying a lot. We have some things we can do to address that, and literally just start with where they are. You know, in the cancer space, a lot of supportive care teams have ended up leading with conversations about pain because that's an easily recognized symptom that everybody knows there's treatment for. And that is their way in to these bigger conversations. Marian, what do you want to add here?
I would agree, Tony, and I think I would absolutely focus on how can we help that particular person. And I would talk about palliative care in a way that made it clear of how it would benefit them. So kind of a little bit back to that first principle. I understand you are really having trouble sleeping at night. I come from a team called Palliative Care, and one of the things we do is we help make people more comfortable. And let's talk about how we might help you at night. And I think once we get in that way, then it doesn't matter what we call it or whether it's hospice or not, because people are like, I know this guy, Tony, and he helped me sleep, and then we're off to the races usually. So I think the patient communication should focus on them, and the public messaging should also focus on things we know the public wants.
Thank you. I was just going to pick up, because I was fascinated by, well, two things. I mean, firstly, this slight cynicism that was detected in terms of the way that patients and caregivers perhaps perceive doctors, and was slightly cynical about motivations, which I found sad. But and related to that, this the power of storytelling, or anecdote versus evidence, as we might say, number evidence, and what that tells us. Those two things seem to be linked, right? So all people hear numbers, they don't hear stories, and they understand stories, they don't understand numbers, and so people become cynical about what we're doing. And how should we combat that, and particularly what implications does that have for the type of research that we do, the balance between qualitative and quantitative research?
Oh, yeah. Marian, would you like to go first on this one?
Well, I don't know that it changes the research we do so much, other than recognizing that qualitative and quantitative research are two different ways to learn about an issue. And that certainly when you're talking about attitudinal things, qualitative is important. You need to try to dig into what a person thinks about something. I think the beauty of positive stories is, especially if they're simple, and people have said so the toolkit includes the stories that we used for the focus groups, and you can use those stories too. They are roughly based on patients, but they're totally de-identified. There's no HIPAA issue with it. But I mean, any story you could tell about positive experiences with palliative care for a person or their family, I think people in the story, they understand what you're talking about much more clearly than trying to define it or list a bunch of services. If you tell a story that shows what the services are, I think people have a much better, because we are storytelling creatures, right? So, and if a story ends well, as in, the person got, left the hospital and was better, had a more positive quality of life, you don't even have to talk about cure or not cure. People think, oh, that was really appealing. I would like that for my mother, or I would like that for me. So, Tony, any thoughts on?
I would just add that don't worry when you're telling a story as an illustration to a patient. Don't worry about HIPAA, because what you can do is you can craft the story so the details aren't recognizable. If you're talking to a patient and a family, you can say, well, gee, I had another patient who was in a situation kind of like yours. They had a big brain injury. And, after this, and this, they actually were able to go home, right? Or if you're in a public space, you can say, I had Mr. X. I'm not going to give his identifying details, but he had a big, you can. So use that as a way to tell stories. And then, your thing about the slight cynicism. So Ed, I'm detecting from your accent that you are maybe a Brit. And right, this is like not slight cynicism. This is massive. And the thing that I learned is that we should not be assuming that patients are listening to us and going, yes, doctor, we're going to do that. Everything you say is true. Actually, they are going, I'm going to look that up. I'm going to Google that. I'm going to call my friend. I'm listen to Fox News. They have a gigantic number of sources of information, which are about half information and half disinformation. And you actually have to build enough trust so that they believe you. So actually, the thing that I really learned from this is that the trust building thing is really huge, and we should all be paying more attention just because we say it's scientific does not hold water with them. It's a much, much bigger thing than I really realized.
You know, something I've heard Tony say about stories as well is even using them with journalists. You know, just to get, sometimes they have no idea what palliative care is. And rather than, I mean, you can read them the CAPC definition and you can talk about the services, but if you told them a short story, I think they would, they're people, they're going to get that. And they'll be like, oh, now I get it.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. I was really interesting. I just think that the, we've had a theme that's emerged over the last day and a half, and a lot of it has been talking about how do we understand quality and how do we take interventions which we're trying to apply to improve quality of life and reduce suffering, and yet sometimes have to sell that to financiers and stakeholders who are interested in the bottom line. And in a way, I relate some of this as well. If, for example, I just wonder if it doesn't tell the power of like mixed methodology, where, that can speak to both audiences. So you do a piece of quantitative research with numbers and it speaks to some of us, it particularly speaks to the physicians, for example. But actually, if you have a mixed methods research with powerful stories alongside that, there's a whole nother audience who are going to access what you're trying to show through the stories, not through the numbers. And actually, maybe that's one way that we try and down some of those barriers and let people access what we're thinking.
I think that's exactly right, because I think the issue that your field faces, in terms of palliative care for neurologic illnesses, is that I think life with a neurologic illness, and I know there's a huge variety here, is a total black box if you go to the general public. Like, think, how many stories about people with a neurologic illness have you seen in People magazine? Well, there's Michael J. Fox, who's living with Parkinson's disease, right, who is out of sight for months and years at a time and then pops up every time he makes a movie. And then, there's Robin Williams, I know you guys were just talking about him, with the really a really scary personal story, right? Like super scary. That's what the public is thinking about in terms of symptoms and living with palliative care. And it's not, and what palliative care, how palliative care appeared in the public version of the Robin Williams story. Boy, I don't remember a thing about it. I realize you've just had a presentation about it that I did not see, but it's a black box. And I think real stories about real people who are getting their life back in different ways, I think those could be incredibly powerful.
And I would also encourage you, as you think about multimodal research, we're doing some additional work on that involves imagery and visuals, and they are powerful. So, I think if you can tell a story and also show pictures of people living well, and I mean, people with neurologic illness, they look like regular people, right? I mean, many of them. So I think some of the photographs that might go along with a positive story might be very appealing.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm mindful as well of that having this framework of understanding, is really important for our individual interactions with patients as well and caregivers, because sometimes it's so important that we understand the reasons that the barriers that people have to accessing care. And if these barriers are so strong, actually, if we offer it once and we don't get the response we're expecting, and then you get this negative feedback where doctors and clinicians then go, oh, well, I kind of went there once and I can't go there again, I might offend them. And so actually being open to discourse and open to raising issues more than once potentially, that having that framework of understanding helps us to do that, because the barriers aren't there for us because we understand the terms. And so
exactly,
really important.
Yes.
Actually. So the way that we can apply that understanding of the wider public messaging and public perceptions into our individual practice. I've been waffling on so that people could upload more questions, and I'm glad to say they have. So we have another question. Again, it just comes back slightly to renaming palliative care. So understand why we may not want to rename it. However, I encounter patients sharing with me the name palliative care signifies negative meaning for them and makes them less willing to explore. Any suggestions? I guess we've kind of covered that a bit. But again,
Well, I think what I would think we would do. So, okay, this is a clinical conversation, right?
Yeah.
So somebody has disclosed to you in a patient context that, oh, I've heard about care. And you might say, well, what is it you've heard about palliative care? Tell me what your concerns are. And then just like you would help, correct somebody's misunderstanding about any other medical thing, you might say, well, I understand how you might think that, but actually palliative care could help you in the following ways. Or using Tony's example, I had a patient in a similar situation who got palliative care, and here's how it made a difference in their life. So I think it's not just stopping when they say, I don't know, this doesn't sound good. It's trying to figure out why is it a concern for them, and then trying to overcome that by, giving them information that's actually not correct, without saying to them, you've got that wrong,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And understanding, again, that same thing. So if we understand what the barrier is, then we can hopefully use the one-to-one skills to try and break it down.
Well, and also not that, and know the barrier to overcome, but also know the aspiration. What does that patient want? If they've lost part of their life, what are they trying to get back? And that actually can be a really powerful motivator. And connecting some kind of service to that, you can always say, so I hear you're skeptical. I hear you have some concerns. I think they could really help you with, your sleep and your worry. And would you be willing to talk to them once? You don't have to keep going if you don't like them, but give them a try. Give them a try. I think that's the kind of power. That's the kind of, power that clinicians have that you can use in a good way.
And, and if they tell you that, well, I've heard that that's for dying patients, you can say, well, that's not the case, but I'm suggesting this for you because you are not dying, right? If they might be frightened that the referral to palliative care is a kind of subtle way that somebody's trying to tell them their prognosis is bad. If that's incorrect, you can say, oh, but no, let me reassure you. I think you have a long time to live, and we're just trying to make it that however much time that is as good as possible. So
Thank you.
I mean, there is this narrative, there is this backstory that is, I think, one of the common assumptions that palliative care is the booby prize that is being offered when there's no curative care, right? The other one is palliative care is the booby prize that's being offered because our health system is trying to save money on you because you are super expensive, right? I think it's important to have those in the background and to surface those assumptions and talk about them when people have them, because you can talk about your commitment to an individual patient in the course of care as a way of bolstering that and building trust that you're not there speaking for the system. You're there as a doctor, a nurse, or a nurse practitioner, or somebody who can see this issue and knows that there are these resources and other knowledgeable people around.
That's brilliant. And did you just want to plug the website for the toolkit again? Because a couple of people asked for that.
Oh yeah, serious illness messaging, all one word, .org. seriousillnessmessaging.org.
Brilliant.
And it's a new website, and it's come out of beta. There are still a few rough parts, but it works. But we would love to hear from you, and especially you are a very targeted audience. We were thinking very generally. So if you look through this and you say, hey, I think this would be helpful to add, or I had a question about this, please email us. We'd love to know.
Well, I really want to thank you for your time and your expertise. It's fascinating insight. It's certainly generated a lot of synapses firing in my head, and we're really grateful for your time and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.